Detective James Carter had seen enough violence in his 15 years with the FBI to last several lifetimes. He'd tracked down organized crime bosses, taken down corruption rings, and put dangerous criminals behind bars. But all he wanted now was peace and quiet in his new home at Willowbrook Estates. 6 months ago, he'd bought a beautiful house in this gated community. The neighborhood looked perfect: clean streets, well-maintained lawns, and friendly neighbors who waved when they saw each other. After years of dealing with the worst humanity had to offer, James thought he'd finally found his sanctuary. It was a Saturday morning in late spring. The sun was shining, birds were singing, and James felt more relaxed than he had in years. He'd slept in until 8, made himself a strong cup of coffee, and decided to spend some time in his front yard. His lawn needed watering, and he enjoyed the simple pleasure of watching the sprinkler system he'd installed do its work. James wore an old t-shirt and shorts, looking nothing like the feared federal agent who made hardened criminals nervous during interrogations. His neighbors probably saw him as just another guy enjoying his weekend. He liked it that way. After spending most of his career in suits and dealing with life-or-death situations, there was something beautiful about being ordinary. As he adjusted the sprinkler heads near his driveway, James noticed his government-issued sedan parked on the street. He'd left it there the night before after coming home from a late meeting at the field office. The car was unmarked and looked like any other black sedan, but James knew some people in the neighborhood might wonder about it. That's when he saw them walking down the street toward his house. 2 men in what looked like security uniforms were heading straight for his property. Something about their walk immediately caught James's attention. In his line of work, you learned to read people quickly. These guys moved with purpose, but there was something off about them. The first man was tall and thin, probably in his 40s, with a mustache that looked like he was trying too hard to appear official. His uniform was navy blue with patches on the shoulders, though James couldn't make out what they said from a distance. The second man was shorter and stockier, with a serious expression that seemed forced. As they got closer, James could see their uniforms more clearly. They looked like generic security guard outfits you might buy online. The patches on their shoulders said something about community enforcement, but the lettering looked cheap and poorly made. "Excuse me, sir," the tall one called out as they reached the edge of James's driveway. "We're with the HOA Enforcement Division. We need to speak with you about a violation." James turned off the hose and walked over to them, keeping his expression neutral. "Sure, what can I help you with?" The shorter man pulled out a small notebook and flipped through it dramatically. "We've received multiple complaints about your vehicle being parked on the street overnight. According to HOA regulations, all resident vehicles must be parked in garages or designated parking areas between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. James almost smiled. Before buying his house, he'd read every single page of the HOA documents. He was naturally thorough, and his FBI training had made him even more careful about details. There was absolutely no such regulation in the Willowbrook Estates HOA rules. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some confusion," James said politely. "I've read the HOA guidelines pretty carefully, and I don't recall seeing that rule." The tall man stepped forward, trying to look intimidating. "Sir, we're the enforcement officers. We know the rules better than residents do. The regulation was updated 6 months ago in a community meeting." This was interesting. James had been living here for 6 months, and he'd attended every single community meeting. There had been discussions about pool maintenance, landscaping, requirements, and holiday decorations. Nobody had ever mentioned new parking restrictions. "Which meeting was that?" James asked, genuinely curious to see how far they'd take this story. The 2 men looked at each other for just a split second. It was quick, but James caught it. In interrogations, he'd seen that same look thousands of times, the moment when liars realized they needed to coordinate their story. "The meeting in January," the shorter one said. "You probably weren't there because you were new to the community." James had been at the January meeting. He remembered it clearly because they'd discussed the budget for repairing the community playground, but he decided not to mention that yet. "Okay, so what exactly do I need to do?" he asked. The tall man seemed relieved that James wasn't arguing anymore. "First, you need to move your vehicle immediately. Then we need to issue you a citation for the violation. After that, we'll need to inspect your property to make sure there aren't any other issues. A citation? James raised his eyebrows. What kind of authority do HOA enforcement officers have to issue citations? This seemed to catch them off guard again. The shorter man fumbled with his notebook while the tall one cleared his throat. We're certified community enforcement officers, the tall one said. We have the same authority as security personnel to document violations and take appropriate action. James nodded thoughtfully. In his experience, when people felt the need to explain their authority, they usually didn't have any. Can I see your credentials? He asked. Both men reached for their pockets and pulled out what looked like official identification cards. James examined them carefully. The IDs looked professional at first glance, but several things were wrong. The photos were clearly taken, with a regular camera, not the specialized equipment used for official IDs. The formatting was slightly off, and the agency name, Metropolitan Community Enforcement Division, wasn't one James recognized. I'd like to call the HOA office to verify this, James said, pulling out his phone. Sir, that won't be necessary, the tall man said quickly. We're here on official business. Interfering with our duties could result in additional violations. James almost laughed. These guys were really committed to their act, but something was bothering him beyond just the obvious fake credentials and made-up rules. Why were they targeting him specifically? How did they know he was a federal employee? And why were they so interested in his car? Look, I'm not trying to interfere with anything, James said, keeping his voice calm and reasonable. I just want to make sure I understand the situation correctly. You said there were multiple complaints about my car. Who complained? The shorter man flipped through his notebook again. We can't release the names of complainants for privacy reasons, but we have documentation of at least 3 separate reports over the past 2 weeks. James had been paying attention to his neighborhood. He knew which neighbors were home during the day, which ones walked their dogs at night, and which ones were the type to complain about minor issues. Mrs. Patterson next door was definitely someone who would complain about anything she didn't like, and she'd been nothing but friendly to him. Mr. Rodriguez across the street was retired military and appreciated James's careful maintenance of his property. Okay, James said. Let's say I move my car right now. What happens with this citation? There's a hearing process, the tall man explained. You'll receive a notice in the mail with a date to appear before the HOA Enforcement Board. If you're found in violation, there could be fines ranging from $50 to $500. James nodded again. This was getting more elaborate by the minute. Someone had put real thought into creating this fake enforcement system. But why? What were they really after? As he stood there in his front yard, listening to these 2 men explain their fake authority, James felt his FBI instincts kicking in. This wasn't just a simple scam. There was something bigger going on here, and he was determined to find out what it was. James decided to play along and see where this would lead. All right, let me move my car, he said, walking toward his sedan. As he reached for his keys, the tall man stepped closer. Actually, sir, we need to conduct a full inspection of the vehicle first. There might be other violations we need to document. This was new. James paused with his hand on the car door. What kind of violations? Unauthorized modifications, illegal, window tinting, noise violations from modified exhaust systems, the shorter man read from his notebook. Standard community vehicle compliance check. James looked at his completely stock government sedan. It was about as modified as a refrigerator. No tinted windows, standard exhaust. Nothing that could possibly violate any real regulation. Go ahead and inspect it, James said, stepping back. The 2 men began walking around his car, taking photos with their phones and writing notes. James watched carefully, noting how they seemed particularly interested in his license plates and the small antenna on the roof that came standard with government vehicles. Sir, this antenna appears to be a communication device, the tall man said, pointing at the roof. Residents aren't allowed to operate radio equipment that might interfere with community systems. James almost smiled. The antenna was standard equipment that receives signals just like any car radio. But these guys seemed determined to find violations that didn't exist. It's just a regular antenna, James explained. Came with the car. We'll need to verify that, the shorter man said, taking more photos. In the meantime, we're going to have to ask you to park this vehicle off community property until we can confise. It meets regulations. Where exactly am I supposed to park it? That's not our concern, the tall man said, his tone becoming more aggressive. You need to remove it from Willowbrook Estates immediately. James felt his patience running thin, but his training kept him calm. These weren't just wannabe security guards having some power trip. They were specifically targeting his government vehicle, and they seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. Let me ask you something, James said. How did you know to come to my house today? If there were complaints, shouldn't I have received a notice first? The two men exchanged another quick look. We respond to complaints as they come in, the shorter man said. Immediate violations require immediate response. But you said there were multiple complaints over 2 weeks. Why didn't anyone contact me sooner? The tall man was getting visibly frustrated. Sir, we're not here to debate procedure. We're here to enforce community standards. You can either comply voluntarily or we'll have to take stronger action. What kind of stronger action? We have the authority to impound vehicles that violate community regulations, the tall man said. We can also issue citations that result in liens against your property. James knew this was complete nonsense. HOA enforcement powers were very limited, and they certainly couldn't impound vehicles or place liens without going through proper legal channels. But he was fascinated by how detailed their fake authority seemed to be. Okay, let's say I don't move my car. What exactly happens next? The shorter man pulled out his phone. We call for a tow truck and have the vehicle removed at your expense. We also file a report with the county clerk's office for violation of community standards. Show me the paperwork that gives you authority to do that. Both men reached into their pockets and pulled out official-looking documents. James examined them carefully. The papers appeared to be some kind of enforcement authorization, complete with official seals and signatures. But just like their fake IDs, something was off about them. The letterhead read Metropolitan Community Standards Authority, which sounded official but wasn't a real agency. The signatures looked authentic, but the names weren't ones James recognized from any legitimate government office. These documents, James said, holding up the papers. Who signed them? County Administrator Robert Phillips, the tall man said, confidently. James knew every county administrator in the area. There was no Robert Phillips in any position of authority. But what bothered him more was how prepared these guys were. Someone had put serious effort into creating fake documentation that would fool most people. I'd like to call Mr. Phillips and verify these documents, James said, pulling out his phone again. Sir, you're being uncooperative, the shorter man said, his voice rising. We've been patient, but you're interfering with official business. I'm just trying to understand the process. The process is simple, the tall man said, stepping closer to James. You comply with community regulations or face the consequences. James noticed both men had positioned themselves between him and his front door. Their body language had shifted from fake professionalism to barely concealed aggression. Whatever this was about, they were getting ready to escalate. What consequences are we talking about exactly? James asked. Fines? Property liens? Possible removal from the community? The shorter man said. And if you continue to interfere with our investigation, we can arrest you for obstruction. There it was. The word that changed everything. Arrest me? James asked. On what authority? We're certified law enforcement officers, the tall man said, pulling back his jacket to reveal what looked like a badge clipped to his belt. We have arrest authority for violations of community standards. James looked at the badge. It was obviously fake. The wrong shape, wrong color, and the text was slightly blurry, like it had been printed rather than professionally manufactured. But more importantly, there was no such thing as arrest authority for HOA violations. Can I see that badge? James asked. You can see it right where it is, the tall man said, letting his jacket fall back over it. Now, are you going to move that car, or do we need to call for backup? Backup? We have additional officers in the area, the shorter man said. They can be here in 5 minutes if necessary. James was starting to piece together what might be happening here. These weren't just random scammers trying to collect fake fines. They were part of something more organized, and they seemed to have specific interest in him and his vehicle. "Before I move anything," James said, "I want to speak with your supervisor." "We are the supervisors for this area," the tall man said. "Then I want to speak with whoever is above you in the chain of command." Both men looked frustrated. They'd clearly expected him to either comply immediately or argue ineffectively. His calm, methodical questioning was throwing off their script. "Sir, you're required to comply with lawful orders from community enforcement officers," the shorter man said. "Continued refusal to cooperate will result in your arrest." "And if I choose to call the police?" "We are the police," the tall man said. "At least we have the same authority in this community." James almost laughed. These guys had no idea who they were dealing with. He'd spent 15 years studying criminal behavior, and everything about this situation screamed organized fraud. But he wanted to see how far they'd push it. "All right," James said, reaching for his car keys. "Let me move the car." As he bent down to unlock the door, James heard one of the men step closer behind him. In his peripheral vision, he saw the shorter man reach for something on his belt that looked like handcuffs. That's when James realized these guys weren't just planning to write fake citations. They were getting ready to actually arrest him. The question was why. What did they really want, and how far were they willing to go to get it? James straightened up slowly, keys in his hand, and turned to face them. It was time to find out exactly what kind of game they were playing. As James turned around with his keys, he saw both men had changed their positions. The shorter one now had his hand resting on what looked like handcuffs, while the tall one had moved to block any path toward James's front door. Their fake, friendly demeanor was completely gone. "Actually, sir," the tall man said, "we've decided that moving the car isn't enough. We need to place you under arrest for multiple violations of community standards and interference with official duties." James felt his FBI training kick into high gear. Every instinct told him these guys were about to make a serious mistake, but he wanted to see exactly how far they'd take this charade. "Arrest me?" James asked, keeping his voice calm. "For parking my car on the street? For parking violations, failure to comply with lawful orders, and obstruction of official business," the shorter man said, pulling out the handcuffs. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." James noticed movement in his peripheral vision. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, had come out to water her flowers and was watching the scene with obvious concern. Across the street, Mr. Rodriguez was pretending to check his mailbox but clearly paying attention to what was happening. This was perfect. James wanted witnesses for whatever was about to unfold. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," James said, still playing along. "Maybe we should call the real police to sort this out." "We told you we have police authority in this community," the tall man said. "Now turn around or we'll be forced to restrain you." "What agency are you with exactly?" James asked. "Metropolitan Community Standards Authority, Law Enforcement Division," the shorter man said, stepping closer with the handcuffs. "We have full arrest powers for violations of municipal codes." James almost smiled. There was no such agency, and municipal code violations were handled by actual police and code enforcement officers, not fake HOA security guards. "Can I see your police commission cards?" James asked. "Our what?" the tall man asked. "Your commission cards. Every law enforcement officer carries identification showing what agency commissioned them to make arrests." Both men looked confused. It was clear they had no idea what James was talking about, which confirmed they had zero law enforcement background. "We showed you our IDs," the shorter man said. "That's all the identification we need." "Those weren't police IDs," James said. "Those were security company IDs. Very different thing." The tall man was getting visibly angry. "Sir, you're under arrest. Turn around now or we'll use force." James looked around at his neighbors, who were now openly watching the confrontation. Mrs. Patterson had her phone out and appeared to be recording. "Perfect. Okay," James said, raising his hand slightly. "Before you arrest me, can you tell me exactly what crime you think I've committed?" "Violation of community standards is a Class C misdemeanor," the shorter man said confidently. James almost laughed out loud. There was no such thing as a Class C misdemeanor for HOA violations. These guys had clearly done some research to sound official, but they'd gotten their legal facts completely wrong. "And what's the maximum penalty for this Class C misdemeanor?" James asked. "Up to 90 days in jail and a $500 fine," the tall man said. Now James was certain these guys were running some kind of organized scam. They'd created fake legal authority, fake penalties, and fake arrest powers. But why target him specifically? "Where exactly are you planning to take me?" James asked. "To the community stand. ARD's detention facility for processing," the shorter man said. "Where's that located?" Both men hesitated. "That's not your concern," the tall man said. "You'll find out when we get there." James realized they probably had no idea where they were supposedly taking him. This whole arrest scenario was improvised, which meant they were either making it up as they went along or following a script they didn't fully understand. "Look," James said, "I think we should call your supervisor before this goes any further." "We don't need supervisor approval to make arrests," the shorter man said, moving the handcuffs toward James's wrists. That's when James noticed something that made his blood run cold. Parked at the end of the street was a white van with tinted windows. James had excellent situational awareness, and he was certain that Van hadn't been there when this conversation started. Someone was watching this whole interaction, which meant these two fake officers were part of a larger operation. "Actually," James said, "before you arrest me, I need to ask you something important." "What?" the tall man said impatiently. "How did you know I was a federal employee?" Both men froze. The question had caught them completely off guard. "We didn't know that," the shorter man said quickly. "Then why were you so interested in my government vehicle?" James asked. "You specifically mentioned the antenna and took photos of my license plates. That suggests you knew exactly what kind of car you were looking at." The tall man tried to recover. "We inspect all vehicles the same way." "But you don't," James said. "I've been watching this neighborhood for 6 months. You've never inspected anyone else's car. You came straight to mine." James could see panic starting to set in. These guys had not expected to be questioned by someone who actually knew what he was talking about. "Sir, you're overthinking this," the shorter man said. "We're just doing our job." "Your job with the fake Metropolitan Community Standards Authority?" James asked. "The agency that doesn't exist?" "It does exist," the tall man said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then give me the phone number for your headquarters," James said. "I'll call right now and verify your authority." Both men looked at each other, and James saw something that confirmed his worst suspicions. They weren't just running a simple scam. The look they exchanged was the same one he'd seen in organized crime investigations. The moment when operatives realized their cover was blown. "We don't have to provide that information," the shorter man said. "Actually, you do," James said. "Every law enforcement agency is required to provide contact information to citizens upon request. It's basic transparency law." James was making this up, but it sounded official enough to make them even more nervous. "Sir, you're under arrest," the tall man said, reaching for James's arm. "Stop resisting and comply with our orders." "I'm not resisting anything," James said, pulling his arm away. "But I'm also not submitting to an unlawful arrest by people with no legal authority." That's when things got interesting. The shorter man lunged forward with the handcuffs, trying to grab James's wrist. At the same time, the tall man reached into his jacket for something that definitely wasn't a badge. James's FBI training took over completely. In one smooth motion, he stepped back, grabbed the shorter man's wrist and twisted it until the handcuffs fell to the ground. Before either fake officer could react, James had the shorter man's arm pinned behind his back and was reaching for the tall man's jacket to see what he was going for. "Gentlemen," James said calmly, "I think it's time we had an honest conversation about who you really are and what you're really doing here." The tall man's hand came out of his jacket holding something that made James's blood run cold. It wasn't a weapon, but it was something almost as dangerous. A small electronic device that looked like it was designed to copy information from key fobs or security cards. These weren't just random scammers. They were sophisticated criminals running an identity theft operation, and they'd specifically targeted him because of his government job. "Now," James said, maintaining his hold on the shorter man while keeping an eye on his partner. "Let's start over, and this time, let's try the truth." The tall man stared at the electronic device in his hand like he couldn't believe James had spotted it. His partner was still pinned with his arm behind his back, breathing heavily, and clearly realizing this situation had gone very wrong. "That's an interesting piece of equipment," James said, nodding toward the device. "Looks like a RFID cloner to me, the kind used to copy security cards and key fobs." "I don't know what you're talking about," the tall man said, but he was backing away slowly. "Sure you do," James said calmly. "Just like you know exactly why you targeted my house. Question is, are you working alone, or is this part of something bigger?" James glanced toward the white van at the end of the street. It was still there, and he could see someone in the driver's seat talking on a radio or phone. "Let me go," the shorter man said, struggling against James's grip. "In a minute," James said. "First, I want to know who sent you." "Nobody sent us," the tall man said. "We're legitimate community enforcement officers." "Right," James said. "Legitimate officers carrying RFID cloning equipment and fake badges. That makes perfect sense." James could see neighbors gathering on their porches and lawns. Mrs. Patterson was definitely recording everything, and Mr. Rodriguez had moved closer, clearly ready to help if needed. "Here's what I think happened," James said, maintaining his professional calm. "Someone identified me as a federal employee and sent you two to collect information about my vehicle, my security cards, maybe even get access to my house. The fake HOA violation was just a cover story to get close to me." The tall man's face went pale. James had hit the target. "The question is," James continued, "who's running this operation? Because you two definitely aren't smart enough to organize something this sophisticated on your own." "We don't know what you're talking about," the shorter man said, but his voice was shaking. "Oh, I think you do," James said. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. And I think your friends in that white van at the end of the street, I know too." Both men's heads snapped toward the van. They just confirmed James's suspicion that they were being supervised. "That's what I thought," James said. "So here's what's going to happen. I'm going to let you go, and then we're all going to have a nice conversation about this identity theft ring you're running." "Identity theft?" the tall man said. "We're not stealing anything." "Sure you are," James said. "You were trying to clone my security cards, probably copy my vehicle registration information, maybe even plant listening devices. Classic intelligence gathering operation." James released the shorter man but stayed ready to grab him again if necessary. Both fake officers rubbed their wrists and looked around nervously. "Now," James said, "let's start with names. Real names." "I'm Officer Jenkins," the tall man said automatically. "No, you're not," James said patiently. "Officer Jenkins doesn't exist. Just like the Metropolitan Community Standards Authority doesn't exist. I want your actual names." Both men looked toward the white van again. James could see they were getting instructions somehow, probably through earpieces he hadn't noticed earlier. "Okay, let me make this easier," James said. "I'm Special Agent James Carter with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, badge number 2847. I specialize in organized crime and identity theft cases." The effect was immediate. Both men went completely white and started backing away. "That's right," James said. "You picked the wrong house to run your little scam on. Now, do you want to cooperate and maybe avoid federal charges, or do you want to keep playing games until my backup arrives?" "Your backup?" the shorter man asked. "Oh yes," James said, pulling out his phone. "I called this in about 5 minutes. Hugo. Field agents should be here any moment." This was a complete bluff. James hadn't called anyone yet. But these guys didn't know that. "Look," the tall man said. "This is all a misunderstanding." "No misunderstanding," James said. "You're running an organized identity theft operation targeting federal employees. That's a federal crime with a minimum sentence of 5 years. James was stretching the truth about the mandatory sentence, but it had the desired effect. Both men looked terrified. "We can work something out," the shorter man said desperately. "Maybe," James said. "Depends on how cooperative you are. Let's start with who's in charge of this operation." Both men looked toward the white van again. James followed their gaze and saw the van starting to move. "Looks like your boss is abandoning you," James said. "That's what happens when you work for criminals. No loyalty." The van was definitely leaving. James could see the panic in both men's faces as they realized they were being left behind. "He's not supposed to leave," the shorter man said. "Well, he is," James said. "So now it's just you two and me. And I still want answers." "We don't know anything," the tall man said, but he sounded defeated. "Sure you do," James said. "You know who recruited you, who gave you the fake badges and uniforms, who taught you the cover story about HOA violations. You know where you were supposed to take the information you collected." James could see them weakening. The departure of their supervisor had shaken their confidence. "Look," James said, softening his tone slightly. "I've been doing this for 15 years. I know how these operations work. You're probably just low-level contractors who answered an ad for secure ID work. The people running this didn't tell you what you were really doing." Both men nodded slightly. James had guessed correctly. "So here's the deal," James said. "You help me understand how this operation works, and I'll make sure the prosecutor knows you cooperated. That could mean the difference between probation and prison time." "What do you want to know?" the shorter man asked quietly. "Everything," James said. "Starting with who hired you." The tall man looked around nervously. "We answered an ad on Craigslist for security guards. The pay was really good, but we had to sign non-disclosure agreements." "What did the ad say exactly?" "Community enforcement officers," the shorter man said. "They said we'd be helping maintain neighborhood standards in upscale communities." "Who interviewed you?" "Some guy named Peterson," the tall man said. "Met us at a coffee shop downtown. Gave us the uniforms and training materials." "What kind of training?" "How to approach residents, what to say about violations, how to get close to their vehicles and homes," the shorter man explained. James nodded. This was definitely an organized intelligence gathering operation. "Did Peterson tell you what you were supposed to collect?" Both men hesitated. They were clearly afraid of violating their non-disclosure agreements, even though they were already in serious legal trouble. "Photos of license plates, pictures of security systems, information about work schedules," the tall man finally said. "And we were supposed to use these devices to copy any security cards or key fobs we could get close to." "How many houses have you hit?" "About 20 over the past month," the shorter man said. "All in different neighborhoods." James felt his pulse quicken. This was bigger than he'd thought. 20 houses meant potentially hundreds of stolen identities and compromised security systems. "Were you targeting federal employees specifically?" "Government workers, military personnel, law enforcement," the tall man confirmed. Peterson had a list with names and addresses. This was definitely a national security issue. Someone was systematically targeting federal employees and their families, collecting intelligence that could be used for everything from identity theft to espionage. "Where did you deliver the information you collected?" Both men looked at each other nervously. "That's the thing," the shorter man said. "We don't know. We uploaded everything to a secure website, but we never met anyone else or saw where it was going." James realized he'd stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple scam. This was a sophisticated intelligence operation, and he was just seeing the tip of the iceberg. James knew he had to act fast. With the white van gone and these two men starting to realize the full scope of what they'd been involved in, he needed to secure the scene and gather as much information as possible before anyone else disappeared. "Give me your phones," James said firmly. "What?" the tall man asked. "Your phones. Right now. They're evidence in a federal investigation." Both men reluctantly handed over their devices. James quickly powered them down to preserve any digital evidence. "Now, the RFID cloner and any other equipment you're carrying." The tall man surrendered the electronic device along with what looked like a small camera designed to photograph documents. The shorter man pulled out a USB drive and another device James didn't immediately recognize. "What's this one?" James asked, holding up the unknown device. "Wi-Fi network scanner," the shorter man admitted. "It identifies home security systems and wireless networks." James felt his jaw tighten. This wasn't just identity theft. It was systematic intelligence gathering that could compromise home security systems and personal networks. Okay, James said. Here's what's going to happen. I'm calling my field office right now. You're both going to sit on my front steps and wait quietly while federal agents arrive. If you try to run, I'll tackle you myself and add resisting arrest to your charges. James pulled out his phone and dialed his supervisor's direct number. Agent Martinez? It's Carter. I need a full tactical team at my residence immediately. I've uncovered what appears to be a large-scale intelligence gathering operation targeting federal employees. Yes, at my house. 2 suspects in custody, but there's a larger network. I'll explain when you get here. As James finished the call, he noticed more neighbors had gathered. Mrs. Patterson was still recording, and several other residents were clearly concerned about what was happening in their peaceful community. How many of my neighbors did you target? James asked the 2 men. 3 others on this street, the tall man said quietly. The military guy across the street, the woman 2 houses down who works for the State Department, and the couple at the end of the block. James looked at Mr. Rodriguez's house. He'd known his neighbor was retired military, but he hadn't realized there were other federal employees in his immediate area. How did you identify the targets? Peterson gave us a list, the shorter man said. He had names, addresses, and information about where people worked. Where did Peterson get that information? We don't know, the tall man said. But he seemed to know a lot about everyone on the list. Personal details, family information, work schedules. This suggested someone with access to personnel databases or security clearance information. James realized this could be an inside job involving someone with legitimate access to federal employee records. Within minutes, James heard the sound of multiple vehicles approach. Ching fast. His FBI colleagues didn't waste time when one of their own called for help. 3 black SUVs pulled up to his house, and James felt relief as he saw Agent Martinez step out of the lead vehicle, along with 6 other agents from his field office. Carter, Martinez said, approaching with his weapon drawn but lowered. What do we have? 2 suspects involved in systematic intelligence gathering targeting federal employees, James said. They've hit approximately 20 houses over the past month collecting security information and personal data. Martinez looked at the 2 men sitting on James's front steps. These the suspects? Part of a larger operation, James confirmed. There was a white van providing supervision that fled when I confronted these 2. They're low-level contractors, but they have information about the larger network. Any immediate threats? Unknown, James said. But they were using sophisticated equipment to clone security cards and scan home networks. This could be espionage or preparation for larger criminal activity. Martinez nodded and signaled to his team. Within seconds, the 2 suspects were properly detained and read their rights. Sir, Agent Thompson approached James. We've got neighbors gathering with cameras. How do you want to handle the public relations aspect? James looked around at his community. These people deserve to know what had happened and what threats they might face. Let me talk to them, James said. He walked over to the group of neighbors who had been watching the entire confrontation unfold. I know this has been confusing and probably scary, James began. I want you to know that the immediate threat is over, but I need to share some important information with all of you. Mrs. Patterson lowered her phone. James, what's really going on? Those men said they were with the HOA. They weren't, James said. They were part of a criminal organization that's been targeting federal employees and their families. They were collecting personal information and security data that could be used for identity theft or worse. A murmur went through the crowd. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward. How many of us were targeted? At least 4 houses on this street, James said. But this operation has been active in approximately 20 neighborhoods over the past month. What should we do? Asked a woman James recognized but hadn't formally met. First, contact your banks and credit card companies to monitor for any unusual activity, James said. Second, consider upgrading your home security systems and changing any wireless network passwords. Third, if anyone approached you claiming to be HOA enforcement or community standards officers, please contact the FBI immediately. Agent Martinez joined the conversation. We'll have increased patrols in this area for the next several weeks, he said. and will be conducting a full investigation to identify any other potential targets. As the neighbors dispersed, James felt a mix of satisfaction and concern. He'd stopped an immediate threat and gathered valuable intelligence about a larger, criminal network, but he also realized his quiet suburban life was probably over. "Carter," Martinez said as the suspects were loaded into vehicles for transport. "This was good work. You may have broken open a major case." "It's not over yet," James said. "These guys were just foot soldiers. Someone with access to federal personnel databases is running this operation." "We'll find them," Martinez said confidently. "Your quick thinking today gave us our first real leads." As the FBI vehicles pulled away and his neighborhood slowly returned to normal, James stood in his front yard thinking about what had just happened. He'd come home 6 months ago looking for peace and quiet, but instead he'd stumbled onto one of the most significant cases of his career. His phone buzzed with a text from his supervisor. "Excellent work today. Report to headquarters Monday morning. We're putting together a task force to investigate this network, and we want you to lead it." James smiled as he looked at his house. So much for retirement planning. But as he thought about the sophisticated operation these criminals had been running and the potential threats to his fellow federal employees, he realized he wasn't ready to step away from the job just yet. Sometimes the most important cases found you when you least expected them. And sometimes the best way to protect your community was to make sure the people who threatened it learned they'd picked the wrong target. As James walked back toward his house, he noticed Mrs. Patterson approaching with a plate of cookies. "I thought you might need these after all that excitement," she said with a smile. "And I wanted to thank you for protecting our neighborhood." James accepted the cookies gratefully. "Just doing my job, ma'am." "No," she said seriously. "You were doing much more than that. You were protecting your family, and that's exactly the kind of neighbor we want in Willowbrook Estates." As she walked away, James realized that maybe he had found the peace and quiet he'd been looking for after all. It just came with the knowledge that he'd always be ready to defend it when necessary.